Chapter 5. David Hunter Duncan makes a request. Jim Garfield sat on his BMW 1600 parked in his driveway. He was attired in coveralls, riding gloves, riding boots, with radio helmet at the ready. Jim Garfield always kept a clean bike, and he bristled at a squash bug on the headlight that he had somehow overlooked when he put his filly in her stall. The spatter left a small dot on the headlight's beam that a less sensitive rider might overlook. He dismounted and scraped off the abomination with his red bandana. He shook out the rag and returned it to his pocket. It was 11 p.m. and David Hunter Duncan had called some 5 hours earlier to request a face-to-face meeting. Jim Garfield readily agreed. Tiffany had thrown a tantrum when he informed her that he was going for a ride. Had she not been pregnant, Jim Garfield might have been more assertive when she started breaking dishes and glasses and furniture. But pregnant Tiffany was, and so he simply left the house to prepare for his friend's arrival. Jim Garfield found himself yearning for Mary Elizabeth Jones. She was one smart lady. She knew that if he had to meet with Ray or Duncan, it was to conduct business and not to chase tail. Mary Elizabeth understood that it was not to her advantage to know more than she needed to know. She knew that Jim Garfield was a man of substance and that he mingled with men of substance. His actions were not frivolous. But Tiffany was another story. She thought like a twat. Everything was a poorly scripted soap opera with her. In her shallow-ass world, men only left the house to chase women. She didn't understand the effort and energy involved in putting food on the table. What a dumbass. Jim Garfield decided that he would continue to pay her mortgage, but he would find himself a new abode once the baby arrived. Thereafter, he would never spend more than 2 consecutive evenings with a stupid woman. David Hunter Duncan glided his Beamer down the street, and Jim started the engine and flipped on the helmet radios so they could talk as they rode. The men waved to one another, and David Hunter Duncan said, "Follow me," gently into his microphone. Jim Garfield could tell that something, probably the sorry state of his son's life, was weighing heavy on his friend's mind. There was no play in his ride, no kangaroo takeoffs, no swerving no more than 5 miles above the limit, just a boring transport from point A to point B. Point B would be a 7-Eleven about 2 miles from Jim Garfield's house. There, the 2 men would park their bikes at the far end of the lot. They would swagger across the asphalt plain and strut into the store. David Hunter Duncan fixed himself an extra-large fountain root beer, and he treated his partner to an extra-large cherry Slurpee. The 2 men leaned on their bikes with their helmets off and spoke in a quiet tone. "I saw Granger today," David Hunter Duncan stated directly. Stephen Granger was known as one of Houston's top drug lawyers. Jim Garfield nodded, and David Hunter Duncan recounted Delbert Wayne's legal situation. Delbert Wayne's pricey attorney, Donald McGee, was admitted to a Memphis hospital following what was believed to be a biological terrorist attack on the Memphis Federal Courthouse. Hundreds of people, many of whom worked for the U.S. Department of Justice, were hospitalized for treatment for infectious disease. There were no known fatalities resulting from infection, but the only defense attorney hospitalized would succumb to an allergic reaction to his prescribed antibiotics. David Hunter Duncan had paid exorbitant fee to the legendary Stephen Granger in a desperate attempt to remount a legal defense. Granger would not go the distance with Delbert Wayne Duncan's case because Memphis was too far away, but he was willing to review the situation and make recommendations. It was money well spent, David Hunter Duncan told his confidant. Every single arrest resulted from a super snitch known as Confidential Informant Number 1. Granger found out his name. It's James Charles Pierce. Jim Garfield stared intently and sipped his Slurpee. He listened carefully as the story unfolded. Super Snitch was able to lure every single defendant to a place where cameras could record their transactions. They all walked into the trap, all except Delbert Wayne. No matter what, he always changed his plans at the last minute. There are no taped conversations of Delbert Wayne making a drug deal. Jim Garfield had slurped about half of his 64-ounce delicacy, and now the cold shot through the roof of his mouth and deep into his skull. He pressed his tongue against his palate and took a break from his endeavor. It had been years since he had enjoyed a Slurpee, and now he reminded himself to slow down. Granger told me that the prosecution will call Pierce to testify against Delbert Wayne. That is, if he doesn't plead out ahead of time. But then he told me point blank, and I couldn't believe what he said. David Hunter Duncan looked around before continuing. He said, if anything happens to Pierce, they wouldn't have a case against Delbert Wayne. Jim Garfield narrowed his eyes as he listened. David Hunter Duncan continued. If Pierce had a fatal aneurysm, those are Granger's words, then the prosecution would proceed, but any reputable attorney could beat the case. His words, fatal aneurysm. So, how do we talk Pierce into having a fatal aneurysm? Wait, there's more. Even though most of Super Snitch's victims were white, the feds believe they are linked to the Mexican alliance. So, meaning if someone put a slug between Pierce's eyes, the feds would suspect the alliance. Jim Garfield quaffed once more in his Slurpee and summarized. We don't have anyone with that particular skill set. I know we talked about developing that sort of talent should this sort of situation arise, but we haven't done that yet. You still have access to the databases, don't you? They're not up to date, but I have most of the state and federal probation records. Names, addresses, phone numbers, skill sets. Can we make this our top priority? Jim Garfield did not answer. His concentration was broken by a limping, sobbing Spanish woman who emerged from the far corner of the building. She bled from her knees and from her open mouth. She limped toward the store entrance, and from around the same corner a stocky Apu Indian raced after her. The two men observed the commotion and tried to make sense of the events. Suddenly the Apu closed the gap and pushed the woman hard from behind, causing her face to crash into the asphalt. Jim Garfield reacted immediately, racing towards the turmoil, carrying his helmet. He considered bashing the aggressor with his helmet, but he eliminated that option for fear of damaging his headpiece. As the aggressor wrestled with his weaker but not smaller prey, Jim Garfield adjusted his stride and was able to plant a solid roundhouse kick to the Apu's head. His foot would have knocked out most men. It would have snapped some men's necks and scrambled some men's brains. But the right combination of tequila and cocaine and benzodiazepines allowed Rafael Hiaga to absorb the blow with no apparent damage. Hiaga calmly eyed Jim Garfield and reached under his shirt for a hunting knife as he slowly rose to his feet. For Jim Garfield, there was the perception of events unfolding slowly. He was familiar with the state, and he knew he was in control. He tugged on a 6-inch fishing line that was attached to a lead river weight where it rested in his front pocket. With a practiced and polished maneuver, he whirled the lead weight into Hiaga's forehead. Hiaga flinched but continued towards Jim Garfield. He lunged wildly with the hunting knife, and Jim Garfield casually sidestepped it. "He's mine," Jim Garfield said to himself. "He's mine." Suddenly there was a faint whistling sound, and blood gushed from Hiaga's left eye. Jim Garfield turned to see David Hunter Duncan, who held extended a .25 automatic with an attached silencer. "Oh, shit," Jim moaned. They were in trouble. David Hunter Duncan was a felon in possession of a firearm, and he had an illegal silencer as well. Hiaga lay face down on the asphalt, blood streaming from his lifeless corpse. The woman was sobbing, but everything else was peaceful. No customers at present, and the store clerk did not seem to notice the activity outside his door. As if he had rehearsed for this moment all of his life, Jim Garfield put his helmet on his head and his gloves on his hand, and he yelled at David Hunter Duncan, "Cover our license plates." He sidestepped the pool of blood and retrieved his lead fishing weight. 85% of security cameras are now transmitted to an off-site location. This tidbit from a true crime show echoed in his head as he bounded through the door. "I need your security cam," Jim Garfield roared at the clerk. Without hesitation, the slouching, pimply young white man escorted Jim Garfield backstage, where the security cams fed into a small, portable computer. Could it be? Was this a dead-end circuit? Was this one of the 15% that did not transmit off-site? "It's a closed system," the clerk stated flatly, as if reading Jim Garfield's mind. Jim Garfield ripped apart the connections and snatched the small processor. "I also need a plastic bag," he politely but firmly informed the clerk. Jim Garfield raced out of the store, clutching the computer and the plastic bag. He ordered David Hunter Duncan to empty his root beer and to deposit the straw, the lid, and container in the plastic bag. Jim Garfield did likewise with his 64-ounce Slurpee. He checked to see that his plate was covered in a bandana, and David Hunter Duncan's plate was covered with a white T-shirt. Holding the plastic bag and the computer, Jim Garfield led the duo out of the parking lot as a lazy blue pickup barged onto the premises. A few blocks down the road, the two riders turned onto a side street to remove the fabric from the license plates. Jim Garfield handed David Hunter Duncan the computer and said, "The creek," over the radio. David Hunter Duncan replied, "Okay." They rode slow, and Jim Garfield littered as they traveled. He held the plastic bag in his teeth and scattered a lid here, a straw there, until the bag was empty. In a matter of minutes, they were resting on a concrete bridge where a small creek trickled beneath them. They removed their helmets. "The creek is dry," David Hunter Duncan yelled into his transmitter. "Toss it," Jim Garfield said. "Toss it." David Hunter Duncan hesitated, but then hurled the small computer like a frisbee into the dry creek bed. Both men would have felt relieved to have heard a splashing noise, but the tab had apparently hit dirt and rock. Jim Garfield was still angry at David Hunter Duncan, but he knew that his partner would not be able to understand his anger, no matter how well it might be explained to him. Jim Garfield had been in control of the situation. There was no need to shoot the bastard. Swallowing his pride, Jim Garfield meekly intoned a verisimilitudously sincere. Swallowing his pride, Jim Garfield meekly intoned a falsely sincere, "Thank you, David." David Hunter Duncan smiled and reached out to shake Jim Garfield's hand. "You're welcome, brother." he said as he looked Jim Garfield in the eye and firmly squeezed his palm. The men returned to their respective homes. Viewing all the broken glass and china, Jim Garfield immediately left a voicemail with the maid, offering triple her usual rate if she could get the house in order before noon. With boots and coveralls still on, Jim Garfield sprawled out on his view room couch and turned the lights off. Jim Garfield replayed the events over and over and over. The sun rose and he still replayed the events. Then a riveting idea interrupted his thoughts. Maybe he should just get rid of David Hunter Duncan. After weighing the pros and cons for a few minutes, Jim Garfield fell asleep.